think I'm supposed to use this, and then you can all hear me at the back. So good afternoon and welcome to the Centre for the Study of International Slavery's 2025 annual lecture. I'm Professor Richard Black, and as you heard, I'm Provost and Deputy Vice-Chancellor at the University of Liverpool. And it's my pleasure and privilege to be welcoming you to this to the Athenaeum this evening. The Athenaeum is a space rich in local history and an apt location for tonight's lecture. Across more than 200 years, the institution has seen Liverpool develop from the nation's largest slaving port to witness generations of activism and research around the legacy of slavery. Founded as a partnership between the University of Liverpool and the International Slavery Museum, for almost 20 years, the Centre for the Study of International Slavery has advanced research around the history of transatlantic slavery. Europe's main historic slave trading ports, the centre is in a unique position to developing of the global impact of slavery. Working with other universities, organisations such as the Athenaeum, community groups and local researchers, the centre develops scholarly and public activities related to slavery in both historical and contemporary manifestations. From workshops to symposia to field trips, the centre's programme of public events is an important aspect of our civic offering at the University of Liverpool. Now, we've had the pleasure of welcoming many distinguished speakers who have made significant contributions in slavery research to this annual lecture, and tonight is no exception. We will hear from Professor Toby Green, Fellow of the British Academy and Professor of Precolonial and Lusophone African History and Culture at King's College London, and with a virtual contribution from Hassoum Cissé, Director General of the National Centre for Arts and Culture in Gambia. Toby and Hassoum will discuss their research on restitution, global inequality, and the future of teaching and research of the history of Africa. Much of the discussion around restitution is focused on historical justice and the concerns raised by some Western institutions. This lecture takes a different approach and looks to the future, asking how a mass programme of restitution of objects would change the dynamic of teaching and research of the history of Africa, and the extent to which this would make a difference to global questions of global inequity. So I'm looking forward to hearing more about this topic, but before we do, it's my pleasure to hand over to Miles Greenwood, lead curator of the International Slavery Museum, to say a little bit more about our fantastic speakers, as well as reflecting on the impact that Toby's influential research on restitution has had on the development of the museum at a time of its historic transformation. There will be a chance to ask questions at the end of the lecture before we invite you to join us for a closing reception. Thank you very much.
So I think that sounds like it's working. Thank you, Professor Richard Black, for the introduction. I'd like to also extend my thanks to Mary Booth for organising tonight's lecture. So to reintroduce myself and offer a little bit of context to today's lecture, my name is Miles Greenwood. I'm the lead curator at the International Slavery Museum. And as Richard mentioned, the International Slavery Museum is at a moment where we're developing plans for the further growth and development of the International Slavery Museum. This will include creating a new entrance in the Martin Luther King Jr. building, which has provided us with the opportunity to recurate the displays at the museum. As with any project, a key question that we're asking ourselves is, where do we begin? And in this particular case, where do we begin with the curation of a museum about slavery? Depending on who you're asking, you might get a range of answers, but a dominant response to that question is that you begin in Africa before slavery. And I can understand this for both intellectual and for emotional reasons why this should be the case. And to be honest, that was what the International Slavery Museum attempted to do when it opened in 2007. Its first gallery is called Life in West Africa, and the design is based on a traditional Igbo compound. Its displays are made up of objects from what is now Ghana, Nigeria, Congo, South Africa, Sierra Leone, and more countries. This poses and continues to pose many problems for the museum, such as how the displays homogenize African societies, how they extract cultures from their context and freeze them in timeless display cases, and more problems beside. but perhaps the most challenging of those problems is that these displays are made up of objects that came from the World Museum, which is itself a colonial museum. And therefore, the majority of collections on display in the International Slavery Museum that attempts to offer something of an insight into life before transatlantic slavery are made up of collections that were acquired under British colonial control of African territories after transatlantic slavery rather than before. This certainly presents us with a challenge. As curators of the International Slavery Museum, we're trying to grapple with how we can effectively convey this complex narrative to visitors. How can we talk about this history from an African perspective? How can we understand life in Africa before slavery, and how can we simultaneously address the colonial extraction of material culture that has contributed to the development of our museums? Though this is the first time meeting Toby, his book, A Fistful of Shells, has provided us with great insight as to how we might grapple with some of this complexity, not just in terms of the subject matter, but also the complexity of African societies and the role that material as culture has played within them in different ways. Toby Green has worked widely with colleagues across Africa, organising events in collaboration with institutions in Angola, Ghana, Guinea-Bissau, Mozambique, Sierra Leone, and the Gambia. His books have been translated into 12 languages and include the award-winning aforementioned A Fistful of Shells. He writes extensively for the media. He has worked on curriculum change in the teaching of African history both in the UK and in West Africa. He is a Fellow of the British Academy and Professor of Precolonial and Lusophone African History and Culture at King's College, London. Joining Toby today for his presentation, I hope, is Hassoum Ceesay. Hassoum Ceesay is a leading Gambian historian, biographer, author, copyright expert, and culture administrator. His early works on Gambian history include 2 books on the role of women in Gambian history and the first full-length biography of the Gambian nationalist leader, P.S. Njayi. His biography of the Gambian Lebanese tycoon, Henry John Mahdi, came out in 2022. His book titled Stowaway Stories, Gambian Youth in Irregular Migration 1950 to 1955 is published by Genesis Publishing UK in 2023. His articles and book reviews have also appeared in a variety of leading historic journals. Please give a warm welcome to Professor Toby Green and Hassoum Ceesay. Thank you.
Going to make sure this is working. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah, good, thank you. Good evening, everybody, and I want to start with thank yous.
Hi, Prof, good evening.
Well, and I want to start with DG. Thank you so much, DG Hassoum, for participating this evening. I'm so grateful to you, and I know that your comments will give us much more to reflect on than I will try with. So thank you very much. I want to thank Professor Black for the introduction, and then Miles and Mary very much for the invitation. When I was invited to give this lecture, I felt that really it was an opportunity to put into words some of the things which I've been thinking about but haven't yet published much on. But it was such a vital question. So I'm really grateful for this opportunity, and good evening to everybody.
Thank you very much, Prof. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, DG. So, many thousands of articles have been written on the question of restitution of historic African... is this working? Not sure the clicker is working.
1 minute.
Okay, great. Okay. Many thousands of articles have been written on the question of the restitution of historic African material productions to the continent, and here am I proposing to add to them. If that seems like a wordy beginning, there was a reason for it. Until very recently, the shorthand for what I just said would be the restitution of African objects to Africa, which summarizes many of the issues at stake which is that historically these objects have been part of the process of objectification of the continent, which has gone hand in hand with its despoliation. Perhaps I'm being unfair. Many of us will say that there has been, and we've heard already from Miles this evening, how much thought is now going into how to present and reconsider and reflect and change all of this. And the word artifact, the substitution of that for object, indicates some of the ways in which this is changing. But it's clear that this change doesn't alter the role which Western museums historically have had in this process of objectification. In his new book, The African Revolution, about Africa's 19th century, Professor of African History at Oxford, Richard Reed, discusses how museums forged in the late 1800s represented a particular reading of the African past, and it almost echoes actually what Miles just said. Europeans sought bureaucratic and administrative exhibitions manifesting a particular reading of tribal history. It was an assumed stasis, Reed writes, which was reflected in the preservation and presentation of African material culture at home. Museum collections portrayed a curious freeze frame of the continent behind glass, a kind of taxidermy of humanity. A static view of Africa as filled with objects from now superseded cultures inaugurated the museological representation of the continent in the era of the heyday of Enlightenment thought, which also inaugurated formal Western colonialism in Africa. In Portugal, the colonial exhibition of 1940 embodied the intersection of objectification, primitivization, and the exhibition. 2 years earlier, in 1938, an exhibition in Luanda, Angolan cultures were portrayed simultaneously as backward, tribal, and somehow stuck. If representations of Africa had a place in that West, it was as primitive art, ripe for the Bowdlerized ripping off by Picasso and his ilk, certainly not as history. That this museological objectification was an important part of the colonial process, no one can be in any doubt. In his famous memorial lecture following the assassination of Eduardo Mondlane, leader of the Mozambican Revolutionary War, Amilcar Cabral, leader of Guinea-Bissau's War of Independence, himself assassinated in Conakry in 1973, wrote, "History teaches us that in certain circumstances it is quite easy for a stranger to impose his rule on a people. But history equally teaches us that whatever the material aspects of that rule, it cannot be sustained except by the permanent and organized repression of the cultural life of the people in question." Cabral contended, therefore, that the struggle for liberation couldn't be completed until the restoration of cultural autonomy and value had been achieved in the emancipation from European colonialism. And yet, over 50 years later, this project remains vastly incomplete. Of course, much of the West which conceived of this relationship between objectivity, museums, and colonizations is long gone. There's been much change, of course. And yet, often it feels like what has replaced it is a kind of heavy noise, the sort of noise which can lead to lots of newspaper headlines and state-of-the-art museums being erected on the continent, but yet little or nothing in the way of action to follow that up. The old is dead, as it is said, but the new is struggling to be born. And that death of the old is nowhere more apparent than in this struggle over the museum space and what it should become, both in the West and in Africa. And that's something I'm going to come back to. But for the moment, in order to frame this a little bit in this introduction, I'm just going to give you a short anecdote. So about 15 or 16 months ago, I was invited to a conference which took place at quite a famous and well-known former colonial museum somewhere in Europe. And we were invited to go and have a look at the storerooms. And with my colleagues, I was kind of rumbling around in the storerooms as we went around, and there were these cardboard boxes on the side. And being a historian, you're generally quite a curious person because curiosity is kind of part of the job description. So there were lids on top of the boxes. I lifted up the lid and I found a skull sitting there staring at me. And the tragic thing about this ossuary, which no one knows what to do with, as budget cuts, reactionary politics, and the immensity of the issues involved ensure, is that this is progress. Because 10 or 15 years ago, these skulls would probably been on display, or even 5 years ago, as they were at the Pitt Rivers Museum, until 2020. We have to do better than this. These objects are going nowhere. unless we actively conceive across nations and peoples of different and more positive futures for them, unless we articulate the questions and the problems, we cannot solve them. And on the other hand, what is even more frustrating than all of this is that the potential of the new could be exciting. The replacement of liberal universalism with something which Achille Mbembe, which I will come back to at the end of the lecture, calls a sort of in common framework of a universalism, is like a mirage at present, tantalizingly just out of reach. But it could be extremely important for human beings around the world. And to achieve this, we must understand the place of these artifacts in Western museums, in the injustice and violence of the past, but we also have to look to the future. And that's what I'm going to try and do this evening. And in doing that, to begin, I'm going to try and understand the present conjuncture. Is the old really dead? What is the new which is trying to be born? So, on the question of the colonial past and its representation through objects, a clear connection has grown in recent years between museums and statues. Historically many here this evening would associate this, of course, with the Black Lives Matter protest following the murder of George Floyd in the summer of 2020, the toppling of the Colston statue in Bristol, and the subsequent controversy around large numbers of statues and the histories that they represent, which have been at the centre of debates. And these, of course, connect to the question of museums because, in each case, the possession of African artefacts or the debates around statues have to do with the colonial violence which relates to the histories of both types of object. So we can understand the question of museums better, perhaps, by historicising the question of the statues. Because a notable thing about the debate on statues is how ahistorical it has often been. The focus has often been on the particular cases and not a broader understanding of the histories they represent and of the histories of statues themselves. But the fact is that as soon as human beings began to erect statues and monuments in the ancient world, in many different areas of the ancient world, other groups of human beings rapidly began to demolish them. People have never, after all, had the same view of history. Why should they? Herodotus tells us in his histories of the Egyptian king Sesostris, noting that, quote, most of the pillars that Sesostris raised in the various lands he conquered no longer seem to be standing. Now, Herodotus was drawing the tales of apparently of the pharaoh Senusret I of the 12th dynasty, who lived around 2,000 years before the Common Era. So these monuments, we learn from Herodotus, never live forever. The people of Rome in particular seem to have thought nothing of using old temples and monuments as building materials. By the 4th century of the Common Era, no one bothered to count the marble statues, as it was said, according to one historian, that there was at least one marble statue for every Roman in a city where hundreds of thousands of people lived. And there were 400 temples in the city, hardly any of which survive to this day. Mary Beard wrote in 2020, quote, the Romans had many ways of dealing with the statues of those they no longer wanted to honour. Some they destroyed. The head of the Emperor Claudius, found in the river near Colchester, may well have been a victim of the rebellion of Boudicca. The head of Augustus, found at Meroe in northern Sudan, now in the British Museum, was almost certainly severed from a statue, destroyed in a raid on the Roman province of Egypt. And there are any number of references in ancient writers to the statues of the short-lived would-be emperors in the civil wars of 68 to 69 Common Era being thrown away. Also, we have to recognise this destruction is not limited to ancient times. There was a vast industry in Germany in the 19th century of building statues to Bismarck. 240 Bismarck observation towers were built. There were 400 statues of Bismarck which were raised across the country. A small number do remain, but many disappeared during World War II. They were smelted for ore. Some were bombed, and others, after World War II, were quietly removed because it was decided that Germany didn't need 400 statues of their unifier after it had again become divided. More recently, of course, many will remember the toppling of the statue of Saddam Hussein during the Western invasion of Iraq in 2003. Statues and their toppling are great symbolic moments in the passing of political orders, and in this sense the toppling of the Colston statue takes its place. What political order has passed? Where are we now? Now, in the context of this evening, what's perhaps interesting is that Colston statue is now in a museum, but a different type of museum, M. Shedd's Bristol People Gallery. It's part of a display of the history of protest in Bristol. The distinction between a public commemoration and an objectified reflection is clear in that choice and can help us to think about what the place of the museum might be in this context. Fundamentally, the consequence is that, as that example also shows, artefacts shouldn't be squirreled out of sight in the hope that they will fall out of mind. A transformed global world demands debates that do justice to the new society being born, and that doesn't mean trying to forget the artefacts that we have, but it means we need to place them in a more meaningful dialogue with one another. and in doing this, understand the centrality of the position that museums play not only in cultural, but also, as I'm now going to discuss, in economic life. For I will contend this evening that meaningfully addressing the question of restitution has in fact an essential role in something which is barely ever discussed, which is the rising of current mass economic injustice facing the African continent. So, let's consider the current situation in Africa. It's important to do this because it's been systematically unreported in Western media over the past 5 years. But the fact is that two Western-led policies, global COVID lockdowns and the war in Ukraine, have led to a situation in Africa which the New Internationalist has described as structural adjustment 2.0. I won't go through all the details, but I will summarise by saying that about 15 months ago, Oxfam projected that 57% of low-income countries will have to cut their public spending by a combined $229 billion over the next 5 years. What has this got to do with museums, statues and such like, you're asking? Well, the fact is that economic destructiveness in Africa, predicated on particular Western universals, continues unchecked. And this is a vital context which yet has been completely absent in the debate over restitution in the past 5 years. That debate is firmly pitched into the past to do with past injustices, which of course are entirely relevant. But somehow the present doesn't feature there perhaps as much as it should. My argument this evening is that to fully understand the question of restitution, we have to understand the place that museums and the discipline of history have had in world economic life, and the significance of that in both the present and of course in the past. We need to remember that history and the cultures of the modern museum were born in the era of the European Enlightenment. A new mythology was needed to replace the religious mythology which was in decline. History and nationalism stepped in where religious myths had previously stood. For human societies, it turns out, can't entirely dispose of myths, even if the ones we have today and we're reduced to are the myth that AI will somehow solve all of our problems. And the national historical myths that were born played an important role in the projection of strength which went with the economic frameworks of modern imperial and proto-imperial capitalism. Here we must acknowledge that the birth of the modern museum and of the modern discipline of history in the heyday of European imperialism was no accident. A strong sense of history and of myths of national greatness coincided with a strong sense of manifest destiny which led to the construction of modern European empires in the 19th century. And as noted in my introduction to this talk, central to this project was the mythic representation of Africa and of Africans as freeze-frame peoples and cultures with no history, stuck in the past. Imperial, heroic nations had imperial and heroic histories, but Africa and Africans, it turned out, did not have those histories, and the historical study of Africa as far as the West was concerned could be confined to anthropology, which is indeed why historians of Africa did not feature in many British history departments until the last 30 years or so. In other words, museum collections, as constructed in the 19th century, had not only a historical, but also an economic function. And that function was to be part of the ideological framework which privileged certain economic outcomes, turbocharging global inequality in a way which has continued ever since. And indeed, as I've just discussed, is as bad, if not worse, as it has ever been. So my argument this evening is that this places the question of museum collections and of restitution in a different light. Because most of the debate which takes place regarding restitution does so almost in a vacuum when it comes to contemporary economic inequalities. What is stressed is provenance, colonial relationships, the question of whether or not these objects were perhaps purchased or commissioned, and many other factors. What is rarely discussed is the fact that the mass restitution of African artefacts from Western museums is a key step in reducing current mass economic injustice. For if a strong sense of national and continental pride relates to empowered and nuanced understandings of a place's history, then mass restitution of these artefacts has a central role to play in addressing contemporary economic injustice. So to reflect further on this, we can think for a moment about the importance which museum visits have in Western schools. And I would suggest that museum visits are seen as important because they are important. They provide that sense of empowerment and connection to cultures, which leads to other kinds of empowerment in life, including economic empowerment. So if a program of mass restitution were to take place of artifacts now housed in Western collections in Africa, such a project would certainly have significant economic benefits in Africa. It would be a starting point, real and tangible, in addressing the inequalities which beset Western societies and the consequences of this in their immoral relationships with Africa. On the other hand, also, we can recognise a future where museums across the world display a range of artefacts from across the world could be hugely exciting. And yet, bizarrely, in all this discussion in the West, there is another context that is often notable in its relative absence, and that is actually what is happening on the ground in Africa. And how does that take shape? Well, fanfares are given in media to new initiatives on the continent which seek to recast this difficult, painful, unjust history. But less attention is given to the fact that 5 years on from George Floyd and 7 years on from the inauguration of the new Musée des Civilisations Noires in Dakar in 2018, 10 years on from the real initiation of many of these debates in the 21st century, comparatively little has changed on the ground. In fact, this programme of mass restitution has not even got off the spreadsheet or drawing board. The most important and perhaps resonant example for most people here this evening would be Nigeria and the case of the Benin bronzes. In 2019, Nigeria's then Minister of Information and Culture, Alhaji Lai Mohammed, announced the launch of a campaign for return and restitution of Nigeria's looted artefacts. Some countries have made headway, and the country that has done the most to date is, in fact, Germany. In 2022, Germany returned 21 Benin bronzes to Nigeria and legally transferred ownership of over 1,000 more. Some UK museums have made steps, largely on an individual basis so far. Horniman transferred 6 to the Director of Nigeria's National Commission for Museums and Monuments also in 2022. Cambridge University also returned the ownership of the bronzes to the National Commission of Museums and Monuments in 2022, but to date, no bronzes have actually been physically returned. So you can make sense of that one if you can. Meanwhile, the British Museum, with its famous collection, has made no moves to repatriate the bronzes or any of the many objects which it hosts on African art. And here in parentheses, we could note that actually the Africa rooms, if you go to them in the British Museum, haven't changed their exhibition at all, as far as I can see, in at least 15 years. There are huge swathes, thousands of artefacts from the continent held in store, which nobody can, they're just not on public display. What this means in practice, is that to date, what changes have taken place have generally taken place on paper. In physical terms, 21 bronzes were returned from Germany, 6 from the UK. A further level of complication is a dispute which has since arisen also between the Oba of Benin and the Museum of West African Art in Benin City as to where those bronzes should be housed, whether in the museum or in the Oba's palace whence they originally came. What does this mean in Nigeria? In November, 3 months ago, the Museum of West African Art, MOWA, in Benin City, Edo, had its official opening, and much attention has been given to this in Western media, to this initiative designed by the architect David Ajayi after an extensive fundraising efforts and conceived as a space for the bronzes looted in 1897 to return to their place of manufacture. But less attention has been given to the fact that this museum, with all the hopes attached to it, lies empty. No artefacts have been returned to MOWA, even as loans. This current state of affairs recalls in some way the history of the Musée des Civilisations Noires I mentioned before in Dakar, funded with Chinese finance and opened by President Macky Sall in 2018. It was hailed in 2019 as one of Times magazine's 100 greatest places to visit, and it also currently lies largely empty. Its huge halls and pavilions filled with blocks of text on the walls and a very few artefacts. France has done little to help its stalwart ally in West Africa, home to what's traditionally been its largest military garrison on the continent in a region which until the recent wave of coups against sitting regimes held many military garrisons of the French. It's true that Macron did, as president, initiate some of the discussions around restitution, but very little has been done from France to change anything on the ground. In 2021, France did return 26 treasures from its Quai Branly Museum in Paris to the Republic of Benin from the Precolonial Kingdom of Dahomey, but this is, again, a fraction. So the message is clear. For all the previous debate about there being a lack of curated spaces in Africa to house the continent's treasures, once these spaces have been constructed, the artefacts or objects remain noisily, loudly, and violently absent. Debates of all kinds can, of course, be had. In fact, as Nosmot Gbamodosi pointed out in Foreign Affairs in 2022, these debates are nothing new. They've been taking place for 50 years with various levels of media, oxygen and publicity funding the debate. Scholars and politicians are quite good at having debates, taking up contrarian points of view, hypothesizing all kinds of rationales which might explain why restituting large numbers of African objects or artifacts en masse is not the right thing to do. Counter-narratives, debates about whether the objects were seized or bought, philosophies of museology and around the curation of international memory houses, all this can and does take place in the public square. Widely read books such as The British Museums by Dan Hicks can be a subject of much discussion and column inches, and then the debate moves on. And naturally, debates also take place in Africa, such as that between the Oba of Benin and the Museum of West African Art. And what all this can tell us is just how powerful the symbolism of these looted artifacts is, how much it means to peoples and societies that they should be restored to public view. And meanwhile, little has changed in terms of what is actually sitting in these museums on the continent. And as we've seen year on year, meanwhile, the economic relationship deteriorates. It's often said that people should be judged by their actions, not their words. African needs and institutional claims on these artifacts can indeed be judged by the construction of these universal museums in Benin City and Dakar, while Western intentions can be judged by the lack of action. After 10 years of radicalized debates, how else can this be seen? What is at stake? History, education, or ownership? Global hierarchies, justice, injustice, or all of the above? Here I've smuggled in an important word to the discussion, which I mentioned briefly at the outset: universal. What distinguishes these two new museums at Benin City and Dakar is the universality of their conception. The museum at Edo, Benin City, is to relate to all of West Africa. At Dakar, it has to do with African civilizations. And in fact, this is something they have in common with the British Museum, for this universalism has hitherto been the preserve of Western museology and academia. In itself, it seems to hint at something radical and important in these ventures and why they need and deserve deep consideration. It's important to bear in mind in the first place that this internationalism distinguishes these museum ventures from the many fine museums which exist in Africa and deal with national histories. Naturally, these museums would also benefit from the return of many objects languishing in storerooms. But of course, they are doing a great job. My dear colleague and friend, Director General Hassoum Cissé, who's going to respond shortly, manages a number of fascinating and important museums and monuments in the Gambia. When I last visited, which was 18 months ago, I saw that schools perform museum trips of 1 or 2 days up country, visiting, for instance, the Wassou Stone Circle Megalith Museum, or the nearby one at Kerbach. Schools often visit the impressive National Museum, the collections there, which really provide a fantastic, brilliant overview of pre-colonial Gambia's history and culture. We can also reflect from a few other examples from West Africa. I'm thinking of Manjia Palace, which is the palace of the Asante Hene in Kumasi, home of the Asante Empire. Here, the exhibit of the Kingdom of Gold has got detailed holdings and provides a thorough history of the Kingdom of Asante and its relationship to neighbouring kingdoms, for example, Mossi, in today's Burkina Faso. And then I also think of the Museum of Jos in central Nigeria. Jos is at the centre of the plateau of the Middle Belt, where over the past 80 years, thousands and thousands of carved heads from a culture known today as Nok have been recovered. Many are kept, some are kept certainly at the museum in Jos. And it provides a glimpse of a culture which began to flourish nearly 3,000 years ago and which can radically rethink the ways in which the pre-colonial African past is considered. So all of this is to provide a national history and a regional history, such as has been the intention of most museums historically. But as I've noted, these museums which I've discussed in Dakar and in Benin City have different intentions, and that's what I'm going to focus on for the rest of the lecture. The ideal of presenting a new African-centred universalist museum is something which would radically change the ideals of both museums and of the world which we now inhabit. Something not only to be welcomed, which, as I've already discussed, might even be essential in our present condition. These days, universalist ideals have a bad press. Liberal universalism, which was at the centre of the rise of modern imperialism, is in retreat. And of course, we need to remember that it's this ideal of universalism which was the ideological fulcrum of the rise of institutions such as the British Museum, the Louvre, and the Musée Quai Branly. Indeed, the museological rationale for the British Museum's refusal to return objects from its collections is precisely the universalist ideals on which the institution was founded, and which it retains in its claim to be a universal repository for humankind. There is, of course, a significant class dimension to such a claim. After all, it's only a certain kind of citizen of the world who can enter the UK freely. as anyone who's had many dealings with the visa system of the UK Home Office can attest. And the reality is that the liberal universalism on which so many of the West museums were founded was indeed the inseparable companion of the liberal imperialism which has laid the foundation for modern inequalities. Why was this? Because this universalist project required the invention of a hierarchy in which, as it happened, those able to make universal value judgments and construct exhibitions of universal interest happened to live in Europe. Not surprisingly, such ideas won't hold. Hardly anyone tries to sustain them in public anymore. But there remains a stubborn refusal to consider the consequences of this change for the condition of institutions founded on the basis of this ideology. If liberal universalism is dead, how and why do institutions founded on liberal universalism persist? The question is posed more acutely by Achille Mbembe in his famous book, Necropolitics. He writes, "The conception of the universal at issue here is not necessarily the equivalent of that which is valid for all humans as humans. Neither is it synonymous with a broadening of my own horizons or a care for the conditions of my own finitude. The universal here is the name given to the violence of the victors of wars that are, of course, conflicts of predation." In other words, liberal universalism was neither liberal nor universal. Its shadow side were war and imperial conquest, the spoils of which were then displayed like trophies in mausolea of cultures known as museums. But my argument here this evening is that this is not to say that the universal is in fact quite dead. As America's current situation shows, if liberal universalism is merely replaced by monopoly capitalism on steroids, this is barely an improvement. Moreover, the fragmentation of collective class-based movements provides little heft with which this movement towards monopoly capitalism under the guise of tech utopias can be contested. So what, if any, form of universalism can be rescued as a counterpoise to the ossuary of contemporary politics, such as is Mbembe's topic in this book? He makes the distinction between the universal and what he calls the in common. Any future democratic world, he argues, will have to rely on a distinction between the putative universal and the in common, which invokes a co-belonging and sharing. And here, for me, the empty halls of the museums in Benin City and Dakar possess a stark symbolic power. On the one hand, they're testament to the emptiness of promises by the international community to build better futures. On the other, their very emptiness is also evidence of the threat that such museums pose to an entrenched system of thought. For the elaboration of proto-universalist or in-common museums in Africa is itself, in its way, a revolutionary challenge to the liberal universalism now in its death throes. To think this through in a different way, I'm going to turn to a recent controversial book by the Nigerian philosopher at Cornell University in the US, Olufemi Taiwo. His book, Against Decolonization, Taking African Agency Seriously, posits that the entire contemporary decolonization narrative has stripped Africans of historical agency and denied the creative reconstruction of imperial languages and ideas that has also characterized Africa's experience of the historical past. Taiwo contends that political decolonization and cultural decolonization have been conflated, and that the latter posits a purity of culture and language which is entirely contrary to the complexity of Africans' histories. Now, personally, I find this distinction between political and cultural decolonization a little artificial because, as I've noticed this evening, the vital project of economic and political decolonization is still far from being fully realized. Nevertheless, it's worth quoting at length from a review of the book which appeared in African Arguments by Anyenkweti Nyamjo to grasp its relevance to this discussion. Nyamjo writes, "An important question raised by Taiwo is the possibility of a critical universalism, and whether this requires abandoning the vocabulary of decolonization. By critical universalism, I mean the belief that a meaningful engagement with Africa in all its specificities can include the pursuit of universal goals and the discovery of common concepts and values. A project, to borrow from Michael Cronin, that is sensitive to both the pathologies of difference and the pathologies of universalism, which risk erasure of and violence towards otherness. For Taiwo, the narrative of decolonization is unsuited to this project because it gives up on the oneness of humanity." Now, as Nyamjo notes, this project of Taiwo's can be criticized as itself providing a one-sided critique of decolonization. But we can surely recognize that without a project to recover common concepts and values, the current iteration of inequality and monopoly tech dystopianism is far more likely than not to continue and get worse. This may be called critical universalism or an in-common framework, which, as Mbembe puts it, requires a democracy of species. If we genuinely want alternatives, nothing can be off the table. Those alternatives must include a fundamental world economic rebalancing, which itself requires empowerment and the economic autonomy in decision-making of African leaders. As I've argued this evening, in this process, historically, we can observe that educational empowerment is key, and the Western economic past itself shows the significance of museums and the discipline of history in such a project. It's impossible to avoid the conclusion. All this requires mass restitution of African objects, artifacts, facilitating the significant expansion of universalist museological projects in Africa, which can offer a critical universalist counterweight to European museological projects, and which would in fact contribute to their renewal and regeneration too. And that is something which we must consider. We can consider whether we want a future in which the problematics of the past and present are tucked away, gathering dust in storerooms which are an awkward embarrassment to the museums in which they sit, as material remains which are out of sight, but not out of mind. Or we can recognise that these ghosts can only be slayed by forging a shared and in common project of human universalism worldwide on a horizontal basis, in which museums enter into critical dialogue and exchange with one another as part of a shared project, and that this would be, in fact, a hugely positive, enlightening and empowering project for everyone. How might such a project come into reality? Well, it takes courage consciously to overturn centuries of thought and a particular way of doing things, but there can be little point at this desperate stage in human history in being constrained by that. Here we may return to Amilcar Cabral. In his essay National Liberation and Culture, Cabral also said, "The study of the history of liberation struggles shows that in general they are preceded by an increase in cultural phenomena, which progressively crystallize into an attempt, successful or not, to assert the cultural personality of the oppressed people in an act of rejection of that of the oppressor. Whatever may be the state of subjection of a nation to foreign rule and the influence of economic, political and social factors in the furtherance of this domination, it's generally in culture that the seed of protest, leading to the emergence and development of the liberation movement, is found." So why, we may ask, are the arts and culture facing such repeated and swinging budget attacks around the world? Why did the structural adjustment policies imposed on Africa in the 1980s begin by devastating the humanities departments of African universities? I believe those are called rhetorical questions. It may indeed be no accident that Western neoliberal politics of the last 40 years has expended so much effort in undermining those sectors which promote cultural activities through which new common values could be found, whether in universities, theatres, or any other sector of the arts. While spreadsheet capitalists may dismiss such activity as unproductive, there is no doubt a shadow side in which the real power of culture to articulate and then overturn oppression is understood, as well as an understanding of the depth of the many different types of social and economic oppression that have meantime been further and further entrenched. Addressing this means recovering the collective power to articulate and emphasize the symbolic power of the arts and of culture to restore humanity and human identities held in common. And the depth of the symbolic and the real political crisis faced worldwide is nowhere clearer than in the empty halls of these universalist museum projects in Africa. Thank you. I invite Hassoum to... DG Hassoum, would you like to respond now? Hassoum, can you hear me? I suggest we move to Q&A.
Yes, I can.
Oh, you're there. Oh,
I can.
excellent. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the wonderful lecture. Good evening to everybody. This is Hassoum Cissé, National Center for Arts and Culture, the Gambia, Banjul. I want to start by conveying my heartfelt thanks to Professor Toby Green, my good friend and brother in arms, as far as the teaching and of of African history is concerned, and to thank the team at the University of Liverpool also for organizing this very, very important lecture. If I remember, I was there some years ago, I think in 2014, yeah, at the university and also at the Center for the Study of Slavery. Now, I want to say that the issue of restitution is a red herring in the sense that it has the potential to distract from other very, very important, issues like, reparations for the, transatlantic slave trade, like, climate justice, like debt relief. All these are other outstanding matters that require urgent attention, but which, of course, people in the, people in authority in the West try as much as possible to downplay. These, very, very important, issues. So restitution has to be discussed or has to be treated, I believe, not in isolation. Not in isolation. Yeah, not in isolation. It has to be treated not in isolation. Because if it is done in isolation, then it's going to be like a lonely subject. It's going to be lonesome. Okay, and it can easily, be put aside. Okay, but when it is discussed together with, these other, urgent and related issues, like, for example, debt relief, because Professor Green has rightly mentioned the economic angle to restitution. He is right. Our museums, are lying half empty. Half empty. Okay, whilst you have, millions of objects, stroke artifacts from Africa, in Western museums or in storage, in Western, museums. Okay, so when we discuss, restitution, it is important to, conflate it with the issue of debt relief, reparations for slavery, and things like climate justice. Okay, it is important so that the issue of restitution does not become a red herring, like a distraction. Okay, and also the issue of restitution has become sort of a wet blanket, okay, a source of discomfort, okay, to many people. Starting with, for example, the great and powerful auction houses, okay, auction houses in the West. They don't like to hear about restitution of objects stroke artifacts, back to, their provenance. Okay, the collectors, art collectors, are not happy. For them, the word restitution, is as uncomfortable as a wet blanket. Okay, the art looters, those who loot, artifacts. Okay, in war, in places in Africa that are experiencing, instability. Okay, there is a lot of looting of cultural of cultural items. There's a lot of looting. I mean, in Mali, I just got a letter yesterday from the authorities in Sudan, requesting for support to, locate, looted, artifacts, because apparently the museum in Khartoum, was ransacked, at the beginning of the ongoing, war in that country. You see, even museums in the West, in the first world, don't want to hear about restitution. Okay, so really the word brings them discomfort. At the same time, the issue of restitution is meant in actual fact to upset the apple cart. Okay, to use a very, very interesting English idiom. This idea of restitution is meant to upset the apple cart, sort of to disrupt the current world culture order. Okay, where you have a hegemony, a cultural hegemony, okay, of some powerful Western countries. Okay, so this idea of restitution is basically to sort of upset this status quo. Okay, in the sense that objects, artifacts are returned to where they rightfully belong. I want to I go back to Prof's idea about the empty museum shelves. It's a fact, not only in those purpose-built museums in Dakar or in the Igbo or Yoruba areas of Nigeria, but throughout West Africa. Our museums have aging exhibitions, faded exhibits, you see, such that what restitution can do is to enliven, to reanimate our museums, you see, to help our children, our students have access to pedagogical material. The role of the museum as an educational space is very, very important. In countries like in many countries in West Africa, where textbooks are hard to come by. Okay, the museum, is like, it's like a textbook, like a history textbook, like a textbook on social studies, on anthropology. You see, so the richer, the more diverse the museum exhibitions, the better. For the students, who come to the museums, on excursions, on field trips, and sometimes even on research, and also where you have, the archives in many countries are inaccessible, either because they are in poor condition, the museum, exhibit, is like a school in itself, so restitution, can even help to sort of, enhance, quality education or access, to quality, to quality education. Now, having said this, I was, last week I was at a UNESCO, organized conference on restitution, in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, and I realized that you have so many, regional and sub-regional groupings, in Africa, all trying to tackle this issue of restitution. 2 days ago, our heads of state were in Addis Ababa also, and restitution, was, on the agenda at the African Union Summit. You see, so I mean, I have the feeling that almost there are too many hands in the soup. Okay, the matter of, like Prof said, the issue of restitution is nothing new. It has been around for a very, very long time. But what is clear now is that you have, it is no longer left in the hands of the technicians, the archaeologists, the museum, experts, the historians, and so on. And now it is even, in the domain of the politicians, of the lobbyists, okay, of the PR, people. So that also is a new dynamism that is worth paying attention to. Okay, I have the feeling that already there are too many hands in the soup bowl, so to speak, and we have to also accept one thing, that a lot of all the countries in Africa, for example, are eager for objects to be restituted, but very, very few, as we speak, are really ready to receive these objects. Of course, that does not in any way, preclude, restitution. It should happen. But the state of our heritage institutions are really not quite favorable to handle let's say an influx of restituted objects. This I know because I have I have over the past 3 decades seen a lot of museums in West Africa and in East Africa. You see. So what is happening now in Nigeria, for example, with the Benin bronze, is where traditional authority, takes up the responsibility to have purpose-built, museums, to welcome, the restituted objects. Well, that is fantastic. But like Prof said, we live in an era where budget cuts to heritage, sector is increasing in Africa and even in the West. Many of the institutions, heritage institutions in West Africa are supported, like for example, by the British Council, by the Coopération Française, by the Goethe Institute, and so on. And even these, Western institutions themselves, are bearing, the brunt of budget cuts. So that also does not give much room, for optimism. But what should make us optimistic, what should make us optimistic is the fact that restitution is a human right, okay? Because many of these objects and artifacts are in fact of utilitarian significance in the areas where they come from, in their regions of provenance. Maybe in the West they are museum pieces, but when they are returned to their rightful villages or hamlets, somewhere in Africa, they become useful again as objects to beg for rain, like rain divination objects, and that is important in this era of climate change and droughts. Some of these objects can help to rebuild social cohesion in fractured African societies. Some of these objects can help to revive lost traditions, and of course, these objects, lying in some storage unit in a museum in the West. Are like symbols of identity. They are symbols of identity. For the people. Who own it? You see. So it is time that we stop seeing them, and Prof alluded to this, merely as objects for museums or for storage, to be viewed and enjoyed. They are more than that. They can play critical roles in reshaping societies and in building hope in many parts of Africa, where hope is really a commodity that is highly needed. Thank you.